In Chapter 12, Robbins only spends a small part of the chapter on CSS selectors, and we've already been using selectors because we skipped Chapter 12 and did some other chapters, and now we're coming back to it. I feel like it's time to emphasize the correct and proper use of selectors because as you start to design more complicated things, you can run into a lot of trouble if you don't understand how the selectors actually work and how to use them correctly. So we're going to work with this page, which is pretty messed up right now, and we'll work our way through it and make it look better. So first of all, the HTML. I've got 3 divs on this page. The first one is a container that's wrapping up everything on the page. So you'll see that as this outer border, and I put a border on all the divs so you can see where they are. And notice these divs each have an ID, a unique ID. So that's one kind of selector, an ID selector that we'll talk about in a moment. So the one on the left is main, and then the one that will be on the right, but right now it's below, that one is lists, right? So it has an ID of lists. And then we go into our CSS and we say, well, how do these things look? The container is specified here. The rule for main is here. The rule for lists is here. So the first thing that you can see about how to use IDs is that when you're in the CSS, you're going to see a hash tag, or sometimes called an octothorpe, the hash mark, and then the name that you've given to the ID. And an ID has to be unique on the page. That means there's only one of these on any page. Back in the HTML, however, you have ID equals and then the name of the thing with quotes around it. Back up to main, the first one, or rather the one on the left, ID equals quote main quote. And the wrapper that's around everything, container, ID equals quote container quote. So in the HTML, using the attribute name ID, and then the value for that attribute is the name, the unique name you've given to that ID. Whereas in the CSS, you never ever see the letters ID. You don't see that attribute here. But what you use for any ID is this hash mark. So the first thing we need to really fix on this ugly page is we need to figure out why my sidebar is falling down below my main article. And it might be a little bit mysterious if you look at the CSS, because you'll see that main has a width of 60% and lists has a width of 38%. With a margin, one margin on the left side only of 2%, and 60, 38, 2 add up to 100. So why wouldn't my two things be side by side? We covered this in an earlier video where we talked about box sizing and the border box. So I'm not going to revisit that, but for the purposes of this video, I am covering the universal selector, which is always used when you fix the box sizing. So how do we do that? We go to the very top of the CSS. The position is important. We go up above the body. Body's usually first, unless you have this thing ahead of it. And I've copied it, and I will paste it to save time. And so this right here, lines 1 through 5, that is the fix for spacing problems in CSS where you don't have things fitting even though you've divided everything up and they add up to 100. And this little asterisk, the universal selector, means apply what is here in this CSS rule to every darn thing on the whole page. So whatever's in here will happen to every single selector, element, everything on the page. So you don't want to put too much in here under the universal selector, or you'd be adding unnecessary weight to your page because, you know, the browser would be looking at everything. But for this particular thing, it is not a problem to add this for most pages. So we'll save, we'll go in and we'll reload, and we'll say, hey, that universal selector really fixed things up. Like I said, I explained box sizing in an earlier video, but right now we've used the universal selector, which is an asterisk, and that has fixed our layout. And because of both the box sizing and the way I've used the container div, this page is relatively responsive. It will adjust, but the problem is it's not optimized for mobile because you wouldn't really want to see this on your phone, right? But it doesn't break, and that is because of the combination of box sizing and the container div. The next thing I want to fix here is the padding inside my divs, because you can see they're touching the edges. That's not going to look very nice. And so I will go into my CSS. And what if I want to put the same amount of padding on all four sides for both the div on the left and the div on the right? So maybe I would just put it here into div. How would that be? Let's say 2 M's. That might be nice. And then I go back in and I reload, and whoa, what happened? Remember, I've got a container surrounding everything. I've also got a div on the bottom that's controlling my floats. And by adding padding to all divs, I added padding where I didn't really need it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go back in, take it off of there, and put it where I really want it, which is inside main and inside lists. So if I reload, now this is more like what I want it to look like. And I realize I don't need the borders anymore at this point, so I could get rid of those. And when I want to get rid of those, I realize, well, I'm not going to do anything to all the divs. I'm only going to do things to main and lists. So I can get rid of that generic selector, right? So save, reload. We're starting to see the page layout come together. What if I want to add a different color? One for the left side, one for the right side. How about white over here? And no change to my lists on the right because I haven't changed the background color for my lists. So let's do that now. We'll go in here and we'll put on a blue color that I happen to have looked up earlier, and save and reload. All right, so by assigning an ID to a particular area of the page, to a particular div or a particular list, we can target certain styles just to that thing with that ID, and nothing else on the page will have the same ID, so we don't have to worry about affecting other things. Now let's say I want to change the heading style. I've got one single font for the entire page, and as usual that is declared up here in the body, and it's a sans serif font. And maybe I want all the headings, H1s and H2s, to be a different font family, perhaps a serif font, and I don't want them to be bold, as headings are bold by default, but I want to change that. So what's the best way to do that? I've got an H1 element already specified in my CSS, and when we talk about selectors, this H1, it's called an element selector. The elements, the normal HTML tags, you're already familiar with those. You can target any element and give it a particular style. We can do that with our H1s, and we could also do that with our H2s. But what if we want to do the exact same thing to H1s and to H2s? There's a way that we can do that, saving ourselves some space and some trouble, and that is with a comma. And so we can actually target two different selectors, even more than two, if we separate them with commas at the beginning of the CSS rule that we're making. So let's say we put in a new font family for headings. And let's do Cambria, which is a serif font, so my generic is serif. And font weight, so I don't want them to be bold anymore, so I need to use font weight to change that. And if I save and I reload, you'll see that both the H1, there's only one H1 here, and all the H2s are instantly affected. Now when I look at that, I think, you know, the contrast of the black on the blue on the lists over on the right side, not so great. So let me go into my list ID and change the font color. So let's make that white, reload. Maybe I do not like it for the headings. If I want to change the H2 headings only in the box on the right side, and I don't want to change them in the box on the left side, then what do? I come in here and I say, first I'm going to do whatever I do below the CSS rule that I made for all headings, because if I put it above, it might be overridden by other heading declarations below. And how am I going to target H2s? Well, like this. But I only want the H2s that are inside the ID lists, the box that has that ID. So what I do is before H2, I reference my ID. And notice that this is different. This is very different from what I just did with H1 and H2. There, I wanted to do the same thing to two separate elements. So I used a comma in between the two. That was necessary. But here, I am saying affect the H2s that are inside lists, the thing with the ID of lists. And here, absolutely no comma. A comma would make it not work. So I'm going to give those headings a different color. And that is going to be this nice shade of green that I had picked out earlier. So let's see. And now I think maybe these headings should be bold. So maybe I will make them bold again. So the way that we just targeted the H2s, only those that are in the div with the ID of lists, that's called using a descendant selector. And what it means is that the thing that you're targeting is a descendant of the thing before it in your CSS rule where you're giving your selectors. So I want to give you another example of that. And in order to do that, let's look at our HTML. And you can see that I have used the element em up here in my H1. And I have also used it several places down inside the text. And I'm going to flip over here and so that you can see, all right, so M by default in most browsers is going to render things in italics, all right? And so I've got an italic in my second paragraph, I've got italics in my first paragraph, and all these things are designated with the normal element em. So what if I want to change only the one up here inside the H1? And I do not want to change any of the others. I want to make the EM that's inside H1 different looking, different in appearance from all the other EM tags in my whole document. How can I do that? We're going to use a descendant selector. And what's descending from what? Descending in terms of CSS selectors means that it is inside the other tag. The EM is inside this pair of H1 tags. So how do we handle that inside the CSS? And again, you want to go below other classes because you want this to be the last thing that affects that EM element that's inside the H1. So it's inside H1 and it's an M. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just change its color to be simple. And I will change its color to a nice blue that I have picked out previously. And I also need to tell its font what? What is the CSS property? I need to tell its font style to not be italic, meaning I have to tell it to be normal. So I save and I reload. Voila. So use of selectors and understanding what you're doing when you choose a selector is really important for you to have good control over how your apps and pages and sites look on all kinds of devices. Color, size, width, padding, spacing, everything depends on your selectors. So I strongly recommend that you practice a lot. And also, one added tip about the chapter. This box on page 245 talks about some more obscure descendant selectors. And at this stage in your learning, you probably do not need to know about any of these. But the one that I showed you with the H1 and the M, that can come in really handy in a lot of cases. So this concludes my overview and my demonstrations of Chapter 12 in Robbins.